So I'd like to introduce Dr. Gale Rigobert. She's a visiting fellow, Interdisciplinary Global Development Center, York University, and principal consultant and CEO of Propel Limited from St. Lucia. Gale has done some WASD meetings with us before, and she's always really, really inspirational, and I think you will enjoy a talk, as I always do. So thank you very much, Gale.
Thank you, Farida. It's such a pleasure to be here. And let me thank you and your other colleagues from Queen Mary for your very warm welcome. I thoroughly enjoyed the presentation by Professor Grant. Thank you very much. Allow me to share with you some of my thoughts on today's topic. Education for sustainable development, the critical role of universities in mainstreaming sustainable development. Higher education institutions are being called to be active agents in the realization of the 2030 agenda. The traditional notion, however inaccurate, of academics pontificating from the ivory tower about policy priorities and how political directorates should go about implementing those are passé. Those days, if ever there was such a time, are over. Many recall the theoretical and policy antecedents to the Sustainable Development Goals, and it seems like only yesterday there appeared to be a similar furrow surrounding the Millennium Development Goals. Students of development studies, economics, international relations in the latter 80s and 90s recall with great nostalgia the verve with which bottom-up approaches to development and the new hope to be found in grassroots development were embraced. So when one traces the genealogy of the Sustainable Development Goals, the measured optimism that often clouds the otherwise hopeful sentiments espoused by the disciples of the SDGs is understandable. Nowhere is this more apparent than in the Global South, where with each iteration of development, there has been a promised panacea to the development woes with very little corresponding evidence of success. Thankfully, more stakeholders, including higher education institutions, are heeding the call to put their shoulders to the wheel and to do their part in ensuring that the SDGs deliver. It is against this backdrop that I share with you some of my thoughts on today's conference theme, the role of higher education in rebuilding the world economy post-COVID-19. More specifically, I shall focus on education for sustainable development, the critical role of universities in mainstreaming development. Allow me, please, to congratulate the World Association for Sustainable Development, with which I've had a long affiliation, Queen Mary University of London, and York University, in particular the Interdisciplinary Global Development Center, for leading by example with respect to the extent to which they've embraced the SDGs, both within their curricular offerings and their operational practices. You do have the moral authority to speak on this subject because indeed you are leading by example. At the recently concluded Transforming Education Summit, held alongside this year's United Nations Global General Assembly, there was a clarion call for educational institutions to do more to integrate sustainable development both in their curricular offerings and in their operational practices. Education for sustainable development, championed by agencies such as UNESCO, for example, must be seen as urgent and necessary to stem not only the impacts of climate change, but also to ensure that for generations to come, humanity will be offered the same privileges that we have had on this planet in meeting our somatic needs and in realizing our ambitions while preserving planet Earth. Reimagining our futures together, a new social contract for education published by UNESCO in 2021, catalogs several key issues that must be addressed if the SDGs are to materialize for the majority of the world's population. Therefore, some key questions for consideration include: how do universities develop sustainable competencies in their students? How do higher education institutions embed SDGs in their operational framework? How do universities align SDGs with subject offerings? How do we integrate and mainstream education for sustainable development, not as an endeavor to be championed by a few, but embraced by the majority? How do we incentivize higher education institutions to embrace the SDGs? How do we characterize the changing role of universities within the context of sustainability consciousness? How do we build resilience in education, a theme that resonates even more so in a post-COVID-19 context, given the challenges that we had with ensuring continuity in education and by leveraging the technology to offer hybrid learning and teaching modalities that would allow for the continuing education of our students. Sustainable financing in education. Only recently we learned that we expect a further global economic contraction. How then, against the backdrop of global economic contraction, the rising cost of living and inflation, and already in some instances, tuition fees that appear to price some out of the tertiary education market, how can we breathe meaning into the notion that education is a right when still it is not accessible by many because of the apparent prohibitive cost? How do we reconcile all of these variables so that indeed when we speak of poverty alleviation, when we speak of SDG goal number 4 on education, that we know we are making material, tangible steps to ensuring that we deliver to the majority of the world's population? The private sector, we do this for you. That is why goal number 17 on partnerships is, to my mind, the linchpin of all the other SDGs, because we simply cannot do it alone. We do need to pool our resources, put our muscles to the wheel, leverage the synergistic or potential synergistic impact that we can have together so that indeed the SDGs can materialize. It was rather curious coming out of the recently held Transforming Education Summit that of the more than 140 countries that participated by submitting commitment statements and undertaking national consultations, that only 1 in 3 countries still in this age reference climate change within the educational offering. So we do have some distance to go still. Innovation in education. How do we leverage emerging digital technologies to ensure that we deliver to students at their point of need? Is there an increasing role for artificial intelligence to ensure that in meeting students at their point of need, we mean that we're meeting them at their point of need geographically, intellectually, and economically? And many educational institutions and governments, I'm sure, recall with some degree of horror the difficulty that we had reaching students and meeting their needs during the COVID-19 inspired lockdowns. And why is that so? It is the same challenge that governments, for example, have in making targeted interventions in delivering social welfare goods and services to citizens. So is there not a way in which we can leverage artificial intelligence and how we capture citizen data, student data, so that we know we have a phenotypical, ethnic, economic, intellectual, physiological imprint of our students, so we know where they are, what they need, how to reach them? And I say this, of course, with the caveat that we need to pay due cognizance to the several ethical issues with respect to leveraging artificial intelligence and citizen data and issues of privacy, for example. Education is a right. It is a right, but too many are still deprived of that right. Women in leadership and academia, a curious statistic still to be spoken of boldly in spaces such as this. Women are still underrepresented in the higher echelons of academic spaces, as is the case, for example, in politics and other subsectors as well. Therefore, how then can higher education institutions lead the charge by not only embracing the SDGs within their academic curricular framework or within their operational practices, but also in terms of their hiring practices, their leadership structures, their financing structures, accessibility. And when I say accessibility and we speak of smart education is not only limited to the integration of technology into education, but it also means accessibility for those with learning difficulties or challenges, physical disabilities. Smart education also means the extent to which we are integrating green technologies into our infrastructure. So I leave you with this thought. How best can we as higher education institutions position ourselves to be champions of the SDGs and to ensure, in the very same way that Professor Grant just described, our very unique position at the center of collaborative efforts, as the linchpin of the partnerships that we need to ensure that together we can do this and indeed deliver to the majority, if not all, of the world's population. I thank you for listening.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very
much. As
kindly.
I said, very inspirational.
Yeah.